Are there any Extinction Rebellion protesters in the room that would like to do their thing before we start? No, excellent. Well, let's crack on. So, Michael, my first question relates to this conference in particular. I mean, you're historically someone who's voted in quite a socially liberal way in the Commons, and I think it's probably fair to say that you'd be described as something of a neoconservative when it comes to foreign policy. And both of these issues are areas where I think you're probably out of step with the national conservatism of the US. So if you could just talk us through, what brings you to this conference and what you think is the insight that national conservatism could offer us here in the UK.
Well, thanks, Madeline. And the first thing to say is I'm grateful that so many people have turned up for this conference because it's evidence of the intellectual energy that we have on the centre-right in this country at the moment. And as you say, one of the things about the Conservative Party in the UK is that it's a field irrigated by lots of different traditions and lots of different rivers. And I would certainly say that on some issues, on issues that relate to people's personal lives and personal choices, I would say that I was a liberal. But I think that the broader question that national conservatives are asking, which is an important one, is at a time when the nation state has become more important in terms of our economic life, more important at a time of polarization in society, what is it that is important about the nation? What is worth preserving? What is worth enhancing? And I've always believed that for a political system to work, there needs to be a balance between liberty and solidarity, a balance between our ability to chart our own course and destiny, and the fact that we're only truly fulfilled when we're working within a set of relationships. And it seems to me that the sorts of things that we ask of people to show solidarity, the tax they pay, their willingness to make sacrifices for others, that makes sense within a community. And the national community is the one which combines the greatest level of durability, accountability, and resilience.
Well, your point about the many rivers and the confluence of ideas, and we've seen some of that playing out today. But I think it's also fair to say that there has been a bit of blue-on-blue action going on here, particularly at this conference. And, I'm interested to know, conservatism historically in the UK, and one of the interesting paradoxes of national conservatism is that although it's an idea that may have originated with Yoram Hazony and is being talked about a great deal in America, it also does accept that every nation is different and therefore you have to play on the kind of inherent qualities of that nation. But one of the inherent qualities of the Conservative Party has always been that it is a broad church, famously so. But given the amount of the open attacks from parts of the party against others, you've got Suella Braverman criticising Home Office policy, you've got Miriam Cates criticising government policy on childcare. Do you believe that, has the tent got too big, too broad?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's a sign of a party and a broader movement that is healthy, that you can have debate. One of the arguments that's sometimes made is that after 13 years in power, the time has come to dispense with the Conservatives because there's a lack of ideas, there's a lack of intellectual energy, there's a sense of exhaustion. I completely disagree. I think what we've seen at different points is the Conservative Party, as it always has, adapting to changed circumstances. So when Conservative modernisers in opposition, when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were Prime Minister, were thinking how the party had to change, there were Conservative principles that they had at heart, but they also recognised that the nature of society was changing. Modernisation, as a process, itself changes over time. So Boris modernised the Conservative Party by making clear that some of the barriers that had existed to people in different parts of the country, feeling that the Conservative Party were theirs, were barriers that he could bust through. So under David Cameron and George Osborne, the Conservative Party first of all began to appeal to people who'd previously voted for Tony Blair and who had flirted with Liberal Democrats. Under Boris, people both in the North and the Midlands, but also particularly people from traditional working class backgrounds found that the Conservative Party was their natural home. We're now wrestling with a new set of issues, and I think it's right that we have those conversations. And again, the broad church analogy is right. The Anglican Church exists in all its glory, because there are evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics, and one of the reasons why Anglicanism has survived is that it suits the temperament in particular of the English, which allows people to have their own character, their own particularity, but within a communion where there is far more that unites than divides.
Yes, well, I mean, it's interesting that you raised the Church of England, because obviously the last few weeks there's been a great deal of criticism from many Conservatives of the interventions from the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm interested also in what is the relationship now between conservatism and the Church of England, given that at least the leadership of the Church of England no longer seems to resemble the Tory party at prayer?
I think it's a long time since you could have said that any Archbishop of Canterbury was a, an enthusiastic, signed-up supporter of conservatism with a large or a small c. And neither should they be. The whole point about being conservative is that you respect institutions. So you respect Parliament, you respect the rule of law, and you respect the Church of England and the role of other churches in the life of this country. And again, one of the things about national conservatism is that it recognizes the particular nature of different jurisdictions. So, conservatism in France, whether it's Gaullism or whether it's, the liberal economic conservatism of some, is different in flavor from conservatism in Germany or conservatism in Spain or in the US or here. Now, we have certain shared figures that we can learn from. I think there are things we can learn from de Gaulle, there are things we can learn from Alexander Hamilton. But in Britain, there are specific traditions, and within those, one of them, I think, is that from time to time, it will be the case that there will be clerics who will, as Old Testament prophets did, criticize those who are exercising secular authority. But the right sort of relationship is one of respect between the two. So, I know that you're a great student of English literature. You will know that one of the great themes, one of the great comic themes of Trollope's novels is the fact that the fate of who's going to become Bishop of Barchester depends on whether or not it's a Whig or a Tory, yes, who's in Downing Street. So there have always been these, I hesitate to say tensions, but there have always been these differences. But the main thing is that within a British context, these differences are reconciled through civilized conversation.
But this is surely another key difference between the US and the UK and national conservatism, for a movement that sets great store by the importance of religion, that actually in a country such as ours, which is far, far more secular, that seems to be another reason in which it's not quite easily imposable in a UK context.
Well, again, I think you're absolutely right, because in some of the commentary that there has been around national conservatism, I think people have tried to suggest that this is somehow an attempt to import American ideas, American ideology, and American conservatism into the UK. From everything that I've read, including the wonderful introductory comments that Yoram Hizoni gave yesterday, national conservatism is about recognizing what is distinctive and cherishable in Britain and in the United Kingdom, and reminding us in a way that a friend from abroad can sometimes remind us of the things of which we should be proud. So, on the one hand, there are conservative thinkers who are distinctively within the British tradition, Burke and Disraeli. We must never forget, of course, that Burke was actually Irish, but still they were part of the British tradition, whom American conservatives believe that we can learn from and of whom we should be proud. But also the way in which our Prime Minister, the way in which Rishi will express his conservative sensibility is going to be different from the way in which an American politician should. And it's that mutual respect, capacity to learn, but also confidence in our own position that I think national conservatism is there to uphold. And again, particularly in a world post-Brexit, post the pandemic, post the war in Ukraine, in which a greater degree of national economic resilience matters more, in which it's a case of thinking about just in case rather than just in time when it comes to our supply chains and our economy. That means that each nation needs to look to its own particular economic as well as institutional strengths.
Are there any, do you think, within the Conservative Party, are there wings that are simply incompatible with this vision going forward? For instance, Andrea Jenkins recently said that she looks around the room at her colleagues sometimes and she increasingly thinks that many of them belong in the Lib Dems. Do you agree with Andrea Jenkins? Does it feel a bit like you're back in the coalition government all of a sudden?
No. I have to say that the coalition government were 5 fascinating years, but I can't think of a single Conservative who reminds me of Chris Huhne. The truth, however, is that there will be people within the Conservative Party who will come to the Conservative Party from different backgrounds. And part of the genius of the Conservative Party has been at different times that the ideological turbulence on the left has meant that there have been some people who started on the left who've made a journey towards the centre and the right. So it happened in the 1970s when you had people like Hugh Thomas and John Vasey and indeed Paul Johnson who moved from left to right. And similarly, there have been people who would have thought of themselves as liberals in the past who've moved to the right. So a particular friend of mine, Paul Marshall, was a Liberal Democrat donor. He supported Nick Clegg's leadership. And the famous cliche is that a Conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. Paul has moved, I think, increasingly towards what I would call the centre, and he's now a supporter of Unheard and GB News. And I think that, if one were to criticise Paul for having been a supporter of Nick Clegg in the past, then one of the most important lessons of our tradition, which is the importance of forgiveness, inclusivity, and the welcoming of the prodigal son, that would be forgotten. So no, I think it's more important to, particularly if you're a political movement that aspires to speak to the nation, to think about being inclusive. Because again, this is one of the things about national conservatism. It's about Conservatives being a party for the whole nation. And that is what distinguishes us from parties of the left or other parties, including pure liberals, who are driven by abstract ideology. So if you are a purist liberal, then you will regard those people who don't share your view as unenlightened. If you're a pure disciple of J.S. Mill, then you will think that there are other people who don't necessarily buy into what you believe, who are people who are living in darkness. Similarly, if you're on the progressive left, you deliberately seek to polarize the world into the woke and the unwoke. Conservatives don't do that. We recognize that within each individual there is something of worth, but that true worth is only fully given expression in community.
But in this very polarized world, I sometimes wonder if Conservatives are almost inherently hampered, because a lot of the time we're quite polite and often quite quiet in our politics. It's more, Roger Scruton described conservatism as more of a kind of instinct than a strong ideology. But in a world where you have adversaries who increasingly want to destroy just about everything that you value, and sometimes in a very dishonest and disingenuous way, does conservatism need to be a bit more robust and a bit more strategic about what it means, rather than just being this broad church that can probably mean all sorts of things to all sorts of people?
I think it is certainly the case that we do need to be intellectually robust, and we do need to examine some of the assumptions with which we've grown up. So, as Miriam Cates has pointed out in a different context, some of the economic principles that were absolutely right in the 1980s may not be right now, and I think Miriam is 100% correct to force us to look again at how the world has changed and how our view of economics might change, and I know that's going to be one of the themes later. So real intellectual robustness. But also, I don't think that there is anything wrong, and I think there's something distinctly British about gentleness and civility in discourse. So, one of the things that is sometimes, what's the word? Sometimes directed against some conservatives is exactly as you say, a critique that they're not fired by the same ardor as some on the radical left. But I think that is a virtue. I think that the overwhelming majority of people in this country prefer civility. They want people, when there are assaults, to stand up for it. And this goes to the whole question of the so-called culture war that is raging at the moment. My own view is there are certain things, certain principles that you should defend, absolutely. And it is absolutely critical that we don't deny biological reality, or that we don't feel that we should apologize for aspects of our past which are genuine sources of pride. But we should do so with the self-confidence that means that we don't need to be strident, that we can draw on those British traditions. You know, that many of the Conservatives that I most admire, from Burke to Baldwin, were not people who felt the need to be strident.
Yes, it's a very good point. One of my good friends, Henry Hill, he's an excellent journalist, and he wrote a column for CapX recently where he basically argued that for conservatism, because there now does seem to be broad agreement in the general public that we don't want to cut the size of the state. So therefore, the old economic argument that used to rage between left and right no longer happens. And therefore, culture has become the new battleground. Do you think there is some truth to this, that conservatives are leaning into cultural issues because they lack answers on the other important aspects of national life?
No, I don't think that. I think that cultural issues have risen in salience for a variety of reasons. And we can run through them all. I think that just the changing nature of the media, not just social media, but the proliferation of different types of media have meant that there are many more different voices, and the way in which social media works, the way in which algorithms work, tend to drive people towards polls, and the way in which particular sections of the media work mean that they tend to become echo chambers. So that is a factor in that. But I think I wouldn't, and I agree with Henry on a lot, but I wouldn't agree with him on that. I actually think that economics is still central. So when it comes to the boring and vulgar task of winning general elections, and the even more boring and even more dispiriting task of governing, the most important thing to do is to concentrate on the right economic policies, the right policies for public service delivery, and so on. And here I think that, and this is part of the virtue of the National Conservatism platform, there is a live debate about what our economic strategy should be. So we'll hear later this afternoon from Juliet Samuel, who has written brilliant columns about the need for us to develop an industrial strategy. Now, for some on the right, the phrase industrial strategy suggests picking winners, intervening, going back to the 1970s. I think not at all. And it's certainly the case that if you look at the leadership that Rishi and Jeremy have shown, they've been clear that there does need to be a case for the UK government intervening when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to education, when it comes to identifying the high-value manufacturing enterprises that are going to be part of our success in the future. That is not a debate that's happening on the left. Their debate is principally about different forms of redistribution, not different ways of maximizing productivity.
But I'm still interested in this idea of how the state functions, because, I mean, as a sort of youngish person, I sometimes feel as if, you know, we have a government that really takes no interest in someone of my generation, that whenever there is the need to raise more money, it often gets piled onto the young, and it's often the end result of this is to try to defend the interests, the ability to retain housing wealth, the inherent interests of older generations. Now, that would be, I think many of us would be far more okay with that if it were clear that there was also work being done to try and either make the state function, so you're not just chucking money into a bottomless pit, or else to keep up the generational side of the bargain, what people like, you know, Edmund Burke was so vocal about.
Completely.
Building enough houses. And yet, everywhere we look, it seems that for instance, on the housing debate, it looks to me like the Theresa Villiers school of thought is triumphing over the Simon Clarks and the Brandon Lewises.
I don't think so, but there is a conversation going on. And again, I think, you know, the approach that both the Prime Minister and I take is one which is absolutely committed to more houses being built, but also to take account of other conservative values as well. So it is absolutely right that we should extend home ownership. And there are a variety of things that we're doing, including looking to reform, for example, the leasehold system.
And how's that going? Because it was reported that there had been a U-turn there.
No, what we're going to do is bring forward some legislation in order to reform that system, because, you know, as you know, the original leasehold-freehold relationship was a relationship which was, you know, when it was first drawn up, hundreds of years ago, was a relationship between a genuinely involved landlord and a genuinely looked after leaseholder. Now it's become a relationship mediated by profit, not by shared interests, but more broadly on home ownership. There are other values as well. So I very strongly believe in beauty. When anything new is built, it will be either an eyesore for generations to come or an object of reverence for generations to come. The Bath of Jane Austen is a source of beauty to these days. The new town of Edinburgh is somewhere where at every turn the eye is delighted. That's not true of every aspect of modern architecture. So I want us not just to provide new dwellings, I also want us to provide new neighborhoods and new settlements that people can delight in. And that's what our planning reforms seek to do, both to have more homes, but more beautiful homes in communities that people can feel proud of.
And so on leasehold specifically,
yes.
Is the policy now to try to reform it rather than to abolish it outright? Because it struck me that leasehold was something that it affects far more people than you would think. And it's something that you could point to as a very specifically conservative policy, namely that you're turning a form of serfdom into true ownership.
Quite.
It's very much in keeping with, well, it's an idea that goes from, Thatcher to Disraeli, the property-owning democracy.
The freeholder, completely.
Yes.
No, well, what we're doing is taking some of the recommendations that the Law Commission and others have put forward in order to ensure that we effectively reduce leasehold to a homeopathic element in the UK property market. So it will still be the case, it's always the case in a country like the United Kingdom, that you will always have little kinks or knots in the wood rather than everything being shaved plain. But what we are doing is making sure that the many abuses that exist as a result of people acquiring freeholds and bilking leaseholders are dealt with.
Right, well, I mean, I think that the question about the offer for the next generation is very important, but I would also like to ask you more generally, since I think our time is running quite low.
Oh, yes.
What, over the last 13 years, and you're rare amongst ministers in actually having been at the cabinet table for much of that time, what do you point to as the key achievements, key conservative achievements of your time in office?
Well, I think the first thing is universal credit. I think Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reforms, making work pay, have ensured that we have a better functioning labour market, greater generosity towards those genuinely in need, and it also proved its worth under Therese Coffey during the pandemic. I think that the education changes which have been made today, we hear that that England is fourth in the world when it comes to the quality of children's literacy. That is down to my friend and colleague Nick Gibb and to others who were there throughout. I think that the emphasis that's now been placed on technical education, where my friend John Hayes was one of the people who was a voice crying in the wilderness 10 years ago and is now ensured that that has become absolutely mainstream as an area of reform. It is the case also that I would argue that, as Ed Balls has pointed out, we've had huge economic traumas visited on us externally, and yet the UK remains one of the most creative and welcoming economic environments in the world. The other thing that I would say is also our cabinet, our parliament, and our leading institutions are, I think, more diverse, visibly diverse, and more meritocratic than ever before. And I also think that if one looks at the recent changes that Rishi has made, particularly when it comes to areas like science, innovation, and technology, we are rediscovering something of the Victorian spirit of enterprise that was responsible for our economic growth and for our luster in the 19th and early 20th century. I could also add the bravery and courage of our armed forces and the way in which Ben Wallace, James Cleverly, and Liz, when she was Foreign Secretary, were so stalwart, and Boris, of course, in defense of Ukraine. I could add also the way in which we've at last begin to address geographical inequality within England. And again, George Osborne in the lead there, but Boris again making levelling up so central to everything that he did. There is a natural tendency amongst Conservatives, and we both share it, as do many people in this room, to look back at the past and to feel nostalgic. My view is that we should look back at the past with pride, particularly in this country, but what we should do is draw lessons from the past about how the institutions that define this nation and its character can be refurbished for the future, and that is very much the approach that Rishi and the Cabinet want to take, which is why I'm naturally inclined to look forward with optimism. not least because there are a generation of younger Conservatives, the Prime Minister chief among them, but many of them in this hall, people like you, Madeline, people like Juliet Samuel and others, who give me hope. If I felt that the Conservative tradition was in the hands of people who didn't communicate it with grace and understand it in their souls, then I would worry. But actually, I think that the new generation of Conservative writers and thinkers and activists, and obviously members of Parliament who've spoken here, like Danny and Miriam, that gives me hope.
I think one thing that worries a lot of us, though, and many people at this conference, is how very difficult it is to mark the usual Conservative milestones that once used to herald someone's arrival to adulthood, to responsibility, to family.
Yeah.
And, low birth rates have been a topic of discussion. And I think it's pretty appalling, actually, how this topic is so often seen as something sinister and kind of far right, as if having children was, problematic in and of itself. But it really, really does worry me when so many of my friends are putting off having children because they haven't got suitable accommodation, or indeed that they are people who a very small c are becoming practically revolutionary because of the expense of doing all of this. And perhaps I'm being a bit too pessimistic, perhaps I'm being a bit sort of Peter Hitchens-like, but I do despair because I don't see the future of conservatism I feel it's more invested in older generations than in the future.
Yeah, no, I think, the first thing is that again, it's my sort of consensus, and I don't believe, you're absolutely right, there is a big problem here, but I don't believe in trying to set generation against generation. I believe that those who have worked hard, saved, invested, deserve to enjoy their retirement. Thrift is a virtue, and also respect for the wisdom that comes with experience. However, you are right. There is a problem, and the problem is, and we touched on it earlier, there simply aren't enough homes in this country. It is increasingly difficult to get on the property ladder. If we want to allow people from whatever background, at whatever stage in their life, to have the joy that comes from becoming a parent, then we need to make sure that they can feel comfortable, that they can either rent or ideally buy a home of sufficient size with sufficient security. There are two factors, though, here beyond that. It's not just supply. It is also the case that in almost all of the places across the globe which are centers of intellectual energy and activity, whether that's San Francisco, New York, Auckland, Melbourne, that property is particularly expensive. And that's also because of the interplay between the way in which the financial markets operate and credit operates and the attractiveness of property in those locations. So we do need to think about supply, but we also need to think about how it is that we can help people, particularly younger people, in that increasingly competitive market to get the first-time buyer support that they need. And that is something that Rishi has explicitly asked me to look at.
Do you think that's compatible with net migration that is estimated to be running at possibly 1 million net by the end of this year?
I don't think it'll reach those figures, but you are right. If we're looking at pressure on housing, you need to look at it in the round. So, Britain's always been a country that has benefited from people of talent arriving here and people fleeing persecution. But the numbers recently have been at a level where there's an inevitable pressure on housing and on public services, just has been the case with longevity. The fact that we're all living longer is something to celebrate. Inevitably, however, it creates pressure on land and capital. So in a well-regulated, in a well-functioning housing market, you can't ignore the pressure that comes from migration as well. And that is why I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right and Suella is right. We need to, and this is a critical part of Brexit, to be able to say, this is the level of migration that as a country we believe is right. This is the level we set. These are the safe routes for people fleeing persecution. These are the points that we will allocate for certain jobs and skills. Beyond that, there is a limit. Every country in the world recognizes that it needs to manage these flows, and managing these flows is a challenge for every democracy. I think it's important for us to work with other countries and to learn from them about how to do so.
I think I probably only have time for one more question, so I'll be very brief. Let's say in some very hypothetical scenario, in perhaps a hypothetical period of time, like maybe 2 years' time, the Conservative Party hypothetically finds itself not in power anymore. And in this very hypothetical scenario, I'm interested to know what inspiration are you drawing from? You know, if we find ourselves in that hypothetical scenario, who are we reading and learning from, and to get in touch with our roots once again?
Well, I think whether or not, win, lose or draw, and I think the Conservatives will win the next election, but I think that the most important thing is there are so many routes. So I think it's vitally important for all Conservatives to read widely, and I do recommend my friend Nick Timothy's Conservative Reader. Those of you who don't, please subscribe. Every Friday, he has a list of contemporary articles, but also books that have been written in the past. So I would recommend to any Conservative Burke, Jane Austen, George Eliot, Robert Nesbitt's The Quest for Community, Alexander Hamilton's The Federalist Papers. I would also recommend everything ever written by Roger Scruton. I would I would also recommend, alongside that, reading some of the interesting and exciting thinkers operating in British conservatism today. I would recommend, inter alia, reading The Spectator, reading The Critic, reading the works of people like...
Michael, I'm right here. You can say The Telegraph.
Madeline Grant, Juliet Samuel, whom I mentioned earlier, but also the works of Policy Exchange, Onward, and so on. There's, even as I list, there's such a rich intellectual heritage out there. But the other thing that I would also ask people to do is to wrestle with some of the questions of the future as well. One thing which I think has been touched on in this conference, which is au courant, is the whole question of artificial intelligence and technology and how it's going to transform things. And it has huge potential transformative benefits for the future. But in the argument about AI, one of the things that I think that we all need to try to do is to remember some of the basic conservative principles about humility in the face of our own capacity to get things wrong, and also prudence in the exercise of power. Those things, very Burkean, very Scrutonian principles, should be exercised when we're dealing with these new challenges. So Conservatives should never retreat into nostalgia, but they must always draw nourishment from those thinkers who've gone beforehand, who have so much to teach us.
Michael, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for listening.